Imagine a place so far above the rest of the world that the sun barely sets in summer, where the Arctic Ocean stretches endlessly beyond the shore ice, and where the largest land predator on Earth walks casually through the edges of town, as naturally as a neighbor heading to the corner store. A place where the nearest city with a traffic light sits hundreds of miles away, across roadless wilderness, where the ground beneath your feet never fully thaws even in the warmest months of the year, and where the community of fewer than 300 people living there has developed one of the most distinctive, most quietly extraordinary ways of life found anywhere on this planet. This is Kaktovik, Alaska, a small Inupiat village perched on a barrier island at the northern edge of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, where polar bears gather every autumn in numbers large enough to draw wildlife photographers from around the world, and where the people who call this place home continue to live in ways shaped by thousands of years of Arctic knowledge, adapted generation by generation to one of the most demanding environments human beings have ever chosen to inhabit. Before we go any further into this remarkable story, if remote communities and the extraordinary lives people build in the world's most challenging corners genuinely fascinate you, go ahead and hit subscribe right now, because today we are going deep into exactly how life works for the Inupiat people of Kaktovik, and you will not want to miss where we head next. Kaktovik sits on Barter Island, a low-lying barrier island pressed against the northern coast of Alaska, so far north that it lies well above the Arctic Circle, at roughly 70 degrees north latitude. The Beaufort Sea stretches directly to the north, gray and ice-covered for most of the year, its surface shifting between open water in the brief summer season and a vast, compressed expanse of sea ice that locks the coastline into near silence for months at a time. To the south, across a narrow stretch of water and a sliver of coastal plain, the Brooks Range Mountains rise in jagged, snow-covered ridges, forming one of the most dramatic and uncompromisingly wild landscapes found anywhere in North America. The Arctic National Wildlife Refuge wraps around the entire surrounding area, 19 million acres of protected wilderness that forms the largest national wildlife refuge in the entire United States, and within which Kaktovik itself represents the only permanent human settlement, the single inhabited point on an otherwise roadless, unbroken wilderness of tundra, coast, and mountain. There are no roads connecting Kaktovik to anywhere else. No highway stretches across the tundra, linking this village to Fairbanks or Anchorage, or any of the larger communities of Alaska, where life runs on a more recognizable modern infrastructure. The only way in or out involves a small plane, typically a propeller aircraft, making the roughly 250-mile flight from Fairbanks, or the slightly shorter hop from Deadhorse, the industrial community supporting North Slope oil operations near Prudhoe Bay. When weather closes in, which happens with remarkable frequency given the extreme Arctic climate, flights are canceled, delayed, or diverted without ceremony, and Kaktovik simply waits, operating as the self-contained community it has always been, drawing on resources and knowledge accumulated across generations, specifically to handle exactly these kinds of extended periods of isolation. The people who live here are Inupiat, members of one of the indigenous Arctic peoples whose ancestors arrived in this region thousands of years ago, developing over countless generations the cultural practices, technological knowledge, and deeply accumulated environmental understanding that make genuine long-term habitation in this environment not merely possible, but genuinely rich and meaningful. The word Inupiat means real people in the Inupiaq language, reflecting the centrality of this identity to how the community understands itself, its place in this landscape, and its relationship to the broader world beyond the Arctic. Inupiat people have lived along the Arctic coast of Alaska for approximately 4,000 years, though earlier human presence in the broader Arctic region extends back considerably further, representing one of the longest continuous human relationships with any single environment anywhere on Earth. A relationship built on intimate knowledge of ice, animals, ocean, and season accumulated across more generations than most cultures can easily comprehend. The village itself is compact, as any community must be when it occupies the limited space of a barrier island bounded by the Beaufort Sea on one side and a lagoon on the other. Small homes, a school, a community center, a church, a small store, fuel storage tanks, and the various structures of a functioning, if extremely remote, community cluster together on ground that is underlain entirely by permafrost, the permanently frozen soil that extends downward for hundreds of feet and fundamentally shapes everything about how buildings are constructed, how utilities are managed, and how the land itself behaves through the seasons. Walking through Kaktovik, you notice immediately how flat and exposed everything is, how the wind seems to come from everywhere at once, how the tree line that most Americans take entirely for granted is simply absent here, replaced by low tundra vegetation clinging close to the ground in a community with the Arctic sky dominating every view from every window. The population hovers somewhere around 250 to 300 people, a number that has remained roughly stable over recent decades, even as many small Alaska Native villages have seen their populations decline through outmigration to larger urban centers. This relative stability is itself significant, reflecting the deep cultural attachment that Kaktovik residents maintain to their home community, even in the face of the very real practical challenges that come with living so far from the broader infrastructure of modern American life. People stay here because this place means something profound to them, because the relationships, the subsistence traditions, the knowledge, and the sense of identity that come from belonging to this specific community in this specific place represent something genuinely irreplaceable, something that cannot be replicated in Anchorage or Fairbanks, regardless of what broader economic opportunities those larger places might offer. The housing stock in Kaktovik consists primarily of small, practical homes built to withstand Arctic conditions, typically elevated on pilings above the permafrost surface to prevent the heat from inhabited structures from gradually thawing the frozen ground beneath them, and causing the buildings to sink, shift, and eventually fail structurally. This elevated construction is a universal feature of building in permafrost regions, one of the most fundamental adaptations required when humans attempt to build permanent structures in Arctic environments, and it gives many northern Alaska villages a slightly distinctive visual character, homes appearing to float slightly above the tundra surface on their supporting foundations. The same permafrost that complicates building also rules out conventional septic systems and buried water lines of the kind found in communities in temperate regions, requiring Kaktovik to manage water and waste through above-ground insulated systems, honey bucket systems in some cases, and water delivery and collection arrangements that differ significantly from what most Americans would consider standard residential utility service. Heating is a constant and central preoccupation of daily life in Kaktovik, as it must be in any Arctic community where winter temperatures regularly plunge to -30, -40 degrees Fahrenheit or colder, and where wind chill can drive the effective felt temperature far below even those already extreme numbers. Homes are heated primarily with oil, the same petroleum that comes out of the North Slope oil fields, a relatively short distance away along the coast, delivered to Kaktovik by barge during the brief summer open water season, when the Beaufort Sea is free enough of ice to allow maritime supply shipments. Managing fuel supply carefully across the long winter is a practical reality of household management in Kaktovik, and fuel costs represent a significant portion of household budgets in a community where average energy costs run dramatically higher than in the lower 48 states, a direct consequence of the remoteness and the severity of the climate that demands so much of it. Electricity for the community is generated locally through diesel generators, again fueled by oil delivered during the summer supply window, a common arrangement in remote Alaska communities that lack any connection to a larger electrical grid. This local generation is reliable enough to support normal household and community needs, including the heating systems, lighting, appliances, and communications technology that contemporary Kaktovik residents use, much as people do elsewhere in modern America. But it carries the inherent vulnerability of any isolated generation system, where equipment failures or fuel supply interruptions carry immediate, community-wide consequences, rather than being absorbed across a large, interconnected grid. The question of what people eat in Kaktovik opens a window into one of the most important, most culturally central aspects of life in this community, and it differs significantly from what the word food typically calls to mind across most of the rest of the United States. Subsistence hunting and gathering remain not simply traditional practices observed for ceremonial purposes or nostalgic connection to the past, but genuinely central, genuinely significant contributors to the actual diet of Kaktovik families, providing a substantial portion of the calories and nutrition that sustain the community across the year. This is not a community where subsistence is a hobby or a weekend activity for enthusiasts. It is a foundational economic and cultural practice without which daily life in this place simply could not function at the standard of food security and cultural coherence that residents expect and maintain. The centerpiece of the subsistence economy in Kaktovik, and indeed the practice most central to both nutrition and cultural identity, is the hunting of bowhead whales. The bowhead whale is a massive Arctic species, capable of reaching lengths exceeding 60 feet and weights approaching 100 tons, one of the longest-lived mammals on Earth, with individuals believed to potentially survive for over 200 years. For Inupiat people, the bowhead represents far more than a food source, though it is an enormously significant food source, providing enormous quantities of muktuk, the whale's skin and attached blubber, that serves as one of the most nutritionally dense and culturally valued foods in the Inupiat diet, alongside the meat, organs, and other portions of the animal that are distributed through community sharing networks and consumed across the following months. The whale is understood as a gift, as a being that chooses to give itself to the community, and the hunt, its preparation, and the distribution of its products are surrounded by cultural protocols and spiritual significance accumulated across generations. Kaktovik holds a subsistence whaling quota, meaning the community is permitted by law to hunt a limited number of bowhead whales each year under the management framework governing Alaska Native subsistence rights and marine mammal protection. The whaling season typically occurs in autumn, when the bowhead migration brings the whales through the waters accessible from Kaktovik, and the entire community mobilizes around the hunt in a way that carries an almost electric quality of collective purpose and excitement. Traditional skin boats called umiaks, constructed from bowhead whale skins stretched over a frame, have historically been used for whaling and remain culturally significant, though contemporary hunters also use modern aluminum boats with outboard motors for the actual pursuit and harvest. The hunt requires genuine skill, coordination, and knowledge of ice, water, animal behavior, and weather conditions that cannot be simply acquired from a manual or a training course, but must be learned through years of participation alongside experienced hunters, knowledge transmitted in exactly the way it has always been transmitted, through direct apprenticeship and practice within a community where this knowledge is living, actively used, and profoundly valued. When a whale is successfully harvested, the work of butchering, processing, and distributing the animal begins immediately and involves much of the community. Traditional roles and responsibilities govern who does what, how the animal is divided, and how portions are shared, with specific allocations going to the crew that made the harvest, to the captain whose leadership and knowledge directed the hunt, and then distributed outward through the community in patterns of sharing that ensure all Kaktovik families receive a portion of the bowhead's extraordinary nutritional bounty. Meat and muktuk are stored in community freezers, or in traditional ice cellars dug down into the permafrost where the permanently frozen ground provides essentially perfect, entirely natural refrigeration year-round, preserving the harvest across the long winter months, when fresh food from outside is essentially impossible to obtain. Walking through Kaktovik and speaking with residents, the whaling season clearly occupies a place in the community's emotional and cultural calendar comparable to nothing else in the year, a period around which social life, family activity, and communal identity organize themselves in the most fundamental possible way. Beyond whaling, the subsistence economy encompasses a broad range of other hunting and gathering activities conducted across the seasons. Caribou are among the most important, with large herds of the porcupine caribou herd migrating through the surrounding region as part of one of the longest animal migrations found anywhere in North America, traversing from wintering grounds in Canada across the Brooks Range and out onto the coastal plain of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge where Kaktovik sits, before returning south in the autumn. Kaktovik hunters pursue caribou using snowmobiles and all-terrain vehicles in season, taking animals that provide significant quantities of meat and hides, contributing to community food security across the year. Caribou hunting knowledge, including understanding of migration patterns, preferred routes, and the behavioral cues that indicate where animals will be found at specific times of year, represents another body of accumulated environmental knowledge, maintained and transmitted within the community, and continuously updated based on annual observation. Bearded seals, ringed seals, and other marine mammals also contribute to the subsistence diet, hunted from the ice edge and open water, using both traditional and modern methods, providing both meat and, in the case of ringed seals, the fur and skin historically used for clothing and equipment, that remains culturally valued and practically important. Fish, including Arctic char and other species found in the rivers and coastal waters of the region, are taken by hook and line, by net, and through traditional ice fishing techniques during the winter months, adding variety and significant nutrition to the community diet. Migratory birds, including various species of waterfowl that arrive in the brief Arctic summer, are also hunted in season, adding yet another component to the remarkably diverse subsistence economy that Kaktovik residents maintain across the full annual cycle. All of this subsistence activity requires deep knowledge of the surrounding landscape and its seasons, knowledge that in Kaktovik is understood as genuinely irreplaceable cultural wealth, transmitted through practice and observation rather than written texts, and maintained through the daily reality of a community where hunting is not optional but essential, not recreational but foundational. Elders hold particular authority and respect in this community precisely because they hold the greatest depth of this accumulated environmental knowledge, having observed more seasons, more animal behaviors, more ice conditions, and more weather patterns than anyone else in the community, giving their understanding a depth that cannot be replicated through any other means. The relationship between generations in Kaktovik carries something of the quality of a master craftsman passing skills to apprentices, except that the craft being transmitted is nothing less than the comprehensive knowledge required to survive and flourish in one of the most extreme environments on Earth. The store in Kaktovik sells commercially produced food, the same packaged goods found in stores across rural Alaska, but the prices reflect the extraordinary cost of flying goods into such a remote location, with a gallon of milk or a box of cereal costing significantly more than it would in Fairbanks, which already costs more than in Anchorage, which already costs more than in the continental United States. This cost differential makes commercial food a significant budget challenge for many families, reinforcing the practical as well as cultural importance of the subsistence economy as a genuine, financially significant supplement to household food security. When you understand that a bag of chips or a container of orange juice has been flown in on a small plane from hundreds of miles away, the price becomes less surprising, though no less challenging for families managing tight household budgets, against the background of an expensive Arctic lifestyle. Supply flights bring not just food, but essentially everything else that modern life requires, and that cannot be produced locally, which in the context of Kaktovik means almost everything beyond the animal products the subsistence economy provides. Hardware, clothing, electronics, medical supplies, school materials, fuel system components, spare parts for snowmobiles and ATVs and boat engines, all of it arrives by air, at costs that reflect the distance and the limitations of small aircraft cargo capacity. During summer, barges deliver heavier goods, including the bulk fuel that keeps homes heated and generators running through the long winter ahead. But the barge season is short, constrained by the brief window when the Beaufort sea ice retreats enough to allow maritime navigation, and the community must order and receive its annual bulk supply requirements within that limited window, with careful planning and no margin for significant error. The school in Kaktovik serves students from kindergarten through 12th grade in the same building, a common arrangement in small Alaska villages where the student population is too small to justify separate facilities for different age groups. It is staffed by teachers who typically come from outside the community, recruited through the North Slope Borough School District, and who live in teacher housing provided by the district as part of their employment. The experience of teaching in Kaktovik attracts a specific kind of educator, someone genuinely interested in the remote Arctic lifestyle and genuinely committed to working within and alongside an indigenous community, where educational philosophy, community values, and appropriate cultural integration into the curriculum matter enormously to residents, who have watched outside educational institutions sometimes work at cross purposes to indigenous cultural preservation rather than in genuine partnership with it. The school curriculum incorporates Alaska Native cultural content, including Inupiaq language instruction, and teachers are expected to engage with and respect the rhythms of community life, including the reality that during whaling season, attendance may be affected by family participation in the harvest. A reality that the community views not as a disruption to education, but as an essential component of the most important education young Kaktovik residents can receive. When a whale is brought in, children may well be at the beach with their families participating in the processing and sharing, learning things that no classroom can teach, and that the community regards as genuinely non-negotiable components of raising children who will be capable adults in this specific place, equipped with the knowledge and cultural connection that sustains the community across generations. For higher education, young people from Kaktovik must leave the community, typically heading to Fairbanks, where the University of Alaska Fairbanks offers programs and has historically maintained particular strength in fields relevant to Alaska Native students, including Indigenous studies, natural resources, and education. This departure carries the same bittersweet quality familiar from other remote communities worldwide, where the pursuit of higher education requires abandoning, at least temporarily, the place and community to which young people are most deeply connected. Some return with degrees and use their education in service of the community, filling roles in local government, health services, and education, while others settle elsewhere, their departure contributing to the quiet demographic pressure that all small remote communities navigate as they try to maintain the population base needed to sustain community functions and cultural vitality simultaneously. Healthcare in Kaktovik is provided through a village health clinic staffed by a community health aide, a system developed specifically for Alaska Native communities where physician access is impossible to maintain on a full-time basis given geographic realities. Community health aides are local residents trained to provide primary care and emergency stabilization, connected by communication links to supervising physicians in larger regional medical centers who can provide remote consultation and guidance. For anything beyond what the clinic can handle, patients must be medically evacuated by air to the regional hospital in Kaktovik, formerly known as Barrow, or in serious cases to Fairbanks or Anchorage, meaning that a medical emergency in Kaktovik involves not just the immediate clinical challenge, but the added complication of weather-dependent air transport across wilderness distances, with all the delays and uncertainties that Arctic flying conditions can impose. Mental health services present a particular challenge in Kaktovik, as they do throughout rural Alaska, where geographic isolation, historical trauma connected to the disruption of traditional ways of life by outside contact and forced cultural change, the difficult transitions associated with rapid modernization over recent decades, and the stresses of life in conditions of both extreme physical challenge and significant economic constraint can combine to create genuine mental health burden that is difficult to address effectively given the limited professional resources that can realistically be maintained in such remote communities. The community itself, its networks of family support, the grounding function of subsistence activities, the spiritual sustenance of cultural practice, and the simple cohesion of a tightly knit small community where people genuinely care for one another, represents the most consistently available mental health resource, one that Inupiat cultural values have always emphasized and that continues to carry enormous practical significance in daily life. The governance of Kaktovik operates through the City of Kaktovik, an incorporated second-class city under Alaska law, with a city council and mayor elected by community residents, managing local services and representing community interests in dealings with the borough, state, and federal governments whose decisions regularly affect life in the village. The North Slope Borough, the local government unit covering the entire North Slope of Alaska, provides significant services to Kaktovik and other North Slope communities, funded substantially through taxes on North Slope oil production, giving this otherwise extremely remote and economically marginal region a local government with resources considerably greater than comparable small communities in other parts of the country. The borough provides school district services, public safety, infrastructure maintenance, and various other services that collectively make a significant difference in the daily quality of life of North Slope communities, including Kaktovik, representing one of the more unusual intersections of petroleum wealth and indigenous community services found anywhere in Alaska. The Kaktovik Inupiat Corporation represents another layer of local governance and economic organization, one of the village corporations established under the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act of 1971, through which Alaska Natives received land and cash compensation for historical land claims in exchange for the extinguishment of those claims to enable development of Alaska's resources. The Settlement Act restructured Alaska Native land relationships in ways that remain both practically significant and sometimes controversial within indigenous communities, including Kaktovik, where residents think carefully about questions of land ownership, resource rights, and the appropriate relationship between indigenous self-determination and the corporate structures imposed by the settlement framework. The village corporation holds certain lands and interests that provide some economic benefit to shareholder residents, adding yet another layer to the complex multi-institutional governance landscape that shapes daily life in this small Arctic community. The federal government's presence in Kaktovik's life is enormous and impossible to overstate, primarily through the management of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge that surrounds the community. The refuge designation and the ongoing political battles over whether and how much of the refuge's coastal plain should be open to oil and gas development intersects directly with daily life in Kaktovik in ways that go well beyond abstract environmental policy debates. Kaktovik Inupiat have historically supported development of the refuge's coastal plain, a position that places them sometimes at odds with national and international environmental organizations, whose opposition to refuge development frames the issue primarily in terms of wilderness and wildlife protection, without necessarily centering the economic needs and perspectives of the indigenous community whose homeland the refuge surrounds. This dynamic reflects a broader, important tension between conservation politics as practiced from outside and indigenous rights to economic self-determination within lands that outside agencies have designated as protected, a tension without easy resolution, and one that Kaktovik residents navigate continuously in their dealings with federal management, environmental advocacy organizations, and the broader public debate around Arctic development. The polar bears are perhaps the feature of Kaktovik life most immediately striking to outsiders, and they deserve extended consideration because the relationship between the community and the bears is genuinely complex, genuinely important, and genuinely unlike almost anything found in wildlife-human relationships in other parts of the world. Kaktovik sits near the center of one of the most significant polar bear gathering areas known anywhere in the Arctic, and in autumn, as sea ice retreats from the Beaufort Sea coast and the bears wait near shore for the ice to reform and allow them to resume their primary hunting of ringed and bearded seals from the ice surface. Significant numbers of bears congregate in the area around the village and along the nearby Barrier Island coastline. The reason so many bears gather specifically near Kaktovik is directly connected to the subsistence whaling practiced by the community. When bowhead whales are butchered, portions of the carcass that are not taken for community use are deposited at a designated area a short distance from the village, providing an enormous quantity of food that draws bears from across the broader region. This is not an accidental or unmanaged situation, but a recognized reality that the community has adapted to over time, with the whalebone pile serving as a focal point that concentrates bear activity in a relatively predictable location, both benefiting the bears, who receive an enormously valuable food resource at a challenging time of year when sea ice hunting is not yet possible, and providing a degree of predictability about where bears will concentrate, rather than having hungry bears wandering unpredictably through residential areas in search of food. Even so, polar bears do regularly walk through Kaktovik itself, moving along the beach, investigating areas near homes, and occasionally causing genuine safety concerns that require careful management by residents. Polar bears are extraordinarily powerful animals, the largest land predator on Earth, perfectly capable of killing an adult human being, and possessed of a curious, investigative temperament, combined with a nutritional drive that can make them persistent around potential food sources. Living in a community where these animals regularly appear is not a wildlife viewing novelty for Kaktovik residents. It is a genuine daily reality that shapes behavior, particularly during autumn bear season, in important practical ways. Parents know their children should not wander alone during peak bear activity periods. Residents pay attention to reports of bear sightings and adjust movement accordingly. Community members who need to travel around the village at night when bears may be active near homes take reasonable precautions, sometimes carrying deterrents or simply making noise to avoid surprising an animal that has wandered closer to the residential areas than might be comfortable. The North Slope Borough and federal wildlife management agencies maintain polar bear patrol programs during peak season, with designated monitors tracking bear movements, managing bear behavior at the whalebone area, and intervening when bears approach village structures or show concerning behavior around residents. These patrols work to allow bears to feed and rest without conflict, while keeping the community safe, a balance that requires constant vigilance, good judgment, and the kind of accumulated practical experience that comes from years of working with these animals in exactly this location. The bears have become accustomed to the presence of the patrol vehicles and generally can be managed with non-lethal deterrence when their movements need to be redirected, though the option of lethal deterrence exists as a last resort when animal or human safety is genuinely at risk. For Inupiat people, the polar bear holds cultural and spiritual significance as well, recognized within traditional Inupiat worldview as one of the most powerful and respected animals in the Arctic ecosystem, an animal that has shared this landscape with Inupiat people across thousands of years. Traditional Inupiat knowledge includes extensive understanding of polar bear behavior, ecology, and appropriate ways of relating to the animal, accumulated through the same long history of shared inhabitation of the Arctic coast that generated the community's knowledge of whales, caribou, seals, and all the other species that share this landscape. This traditional knowledge is not simply historical curiosity, but a genuinely useful and actively maintained body of understanding, complementing and sometimes informing the scientific wildlife management approaches brought by outside agencies to the management of the polar bear population and its interactions with the community. Wildlife photographers represent the primary form of outside visitor to Kaktovik, arriving each autumn specifically to photograph polar bears in the unique setting that this community provides. The combination of bears in relatively accessible locations, the distinctive Arctic landscape backdrop, and the extraordinary light of the far north makes Kaktovik arguably the best location in Alaska, and one of the best in the entire world, for photographing wild polar bears. And the community of wildlife photographers who know about this destination includes some of the most dedicated wildlife photography enthusiasts on the planet. Small boat tours on the waters near the whalebone area allow photographers to observe bears feeding and resting at close quarters from the safety of the water, an experience that consistently generates extraordinary imagery and represents a form of wildlife tourism that has become an important and growing source of outside revenue for the community. This wildlife photography tourism represents a genuinely interesting economic opportunity for Kaktovik, one that aligns with both the community's subsistence practices and its desire for economic development that does not fundamentally conflict with or undermine its cultural values and land use priorities. Unlike oil development, which would involve major industrial activity across the surrounding landscape, wildlife tourism brings visitors specifically because of the intact, undisturbed character of that landscape and its wildlife, creating at least a theoretical alignment between the economic interest in attracting visitors and the environmental interest in maintaining the conditions that make the landscape worth visiting. Community members who provide guiding services, boat transportation, and accommodation to visiting wildlife photographers derive meaningful income from this activity, and there is ongoing discussion within the community about how best to develop and manage this tourism opportunity in ways that genuinely benefit local residents, rather than having the economic benefits captured primarily by outside tour operators. The seasonal rhythm of life in Kaktovik follows a pattern determined almost entirely by the natural environment, the darkness and cold of Arctic winter giving way to the extraordinary continuous daylight of the summer months, then back through the stunning colors of Arctic autumn before the long darkness returns. In summer, when the sun does not set for weeks at a time, the pace of life accelerates dramatically, with the extended daylight driving a burst of outdoor activity, hunting, fishing, gathering, maintenance and construction work on homes and equipment, and the preparation that must be completed during the narrow window of favorable conditions before winter returns. Children play outside at all hours when the sun shines continuously, and the village takes on an almost festive energy as the brief warm season provides relief from the cold and allows activities that winter renders difficult or impossible. The midnight sun of the Arctic summer is one of the most disorienting and ultimately beautiful phenomena of this environment. A sky that never darkens entirely, but instead cycles through shades of gold and pink and soft orange light around the horizon, during the hours when the sun dips to its lowest point but remains above the skyline. Sleeping during summer requires genuine accommodation, with blackout curtains a standard feature of homes in Kaktovik and other Arctic communities, and the body's internal clock requiring real adaptation to a world where the natural light cue for nighttime simply disappears for an extended period. For longtime residents accustomed to this rhythm, it becomes simply the way summer works, a feature of the Arctic that takes some adjustment but ultimately becomes part of the deep seasonal pattern that defines life in this latitude. Winter in Kaktovik is absolute in a way that people from temperate climates can understand intellectually, but may struggle to fully appreciate without having experienced it. The sun barely rises above the horizon even on the clearest winter days, and for a period around the winter solstice, it does not rise at all, leaving the community in polar night where any illumination beyond artificial light comes from the moon, the stars in their extraordinary Arctic clarity, and occasionally the shifting green and white curtains of the aurora borealis, the northern lights that dance across the winter sky in one of the most breathtaking natural phenomena found anywhere on Earth. These lights are not a special occasion or a rare bonus in Kaktovik. They are a regular feature of winter nights, part of the daily sky, and residents speak of them with the familiarity of long acquaintance, though the beauty never quite becomes entirely ordinary. Temperatures in winter reach extremes that challenge even the best modern gear and infrastructure. -30 Fahrenheit is not an unusual temperature, and with wind chill, the felt temperatures can be far more extreme, reaching levels where exposed skin freezes in minutes and where vehicle engines must be kept plugged into heating systems to start reliably. Snowmobiles are the essential winter transportation tool within the community and for travel across the surrounding tundra and coastal ice, replacing the dog teams that served the same purpose for Inupiat hunters in previous generations. Some community elders remember the dog team era personally, a living connection to a different technological moment in the community's history, and traditional dog-mushing knowledge and cultural connection to sled dogs persists, even as snowmobiles have become the practical everyday tool for getting around in winter. The ice itself is one of the most central environmental features of life in Kaktovik, a landscape element as significant as the tundra or the mountains, constantly observed and evaluated by residents whose safety and subsistence success depend on understanding its behavior. Sea ice forms, moves, pressure ridges, cracks, and changes character across the winter, in patterns that carry immediate practical significance for hunters accessing the coast and coastal waters, and the accumulated knowledge of how ice behaves in the waters around Kaktovik, under different conditions of temperature, wind, and current, represents another crucial component of the environmental knowledge maintained within the community. Changes in ice patterns and timing driven by warming Arctic temperatures have become one of the most practically significant consequences of climate change for Kaktovik residents, who observe these changes not through scientific instruments alone, but through the direct daily experience of people whose access to traditional hunting grounds depends on ice conditions remaining within the range of historical experience. Climate change is experienced in Kaktovik not as an abstract future threat, but as a present reality already reshaping the environment in visible, measurable, and practically significant ways. Sea ice is forming later in autumn and breaking up earlier in spring than historical patterns would suggest, affecting access to bowhead whale hunting grounds and to the sea ice hunting of seals and other marine mammals. Permafrost thaw is accelerating along the coastline, contributing to coastal erosion that is literally removing land from the barrier island, shrinking the physical area on which the community sits, and threatening infrastructure built on ground that was reliably frozen for thousands of years and is now becoming less stable. Storm surge flooding, driven by more open water in autumn where historically ice would have formed and provided a buffer, increasingly inundates low-lying coastal areas, threatening homes and requiring costly protection measures. The people of Kaktovik have watched these changes unfold over decades, and their observations represent a form of environmental documentation rooted in the deepest possible knowledge of this specific place, detailed, continuous, and coming from people whose livelihoods and cultural practices depend on accurate understanding of environmental conditions. This indigenous knowledge has been increasingly recognized by outside scientists as a genuinely valuable complement to instrumental climate records, providing insights into longer-term patterns and fine-grained local variation that instrument networks cannot easily capture, and collaborative research projects involving both outside scientists and Kaktovik community members have contributed importantly to broader understanding of how Arctic climate change is actually manifesting in specific coastal communities. These collaborations represent a genuinely productive form of engagement between the community and outside institutions, one where local knowledge is treated as the contribution of genuine expertise rather than simply anecdotal information to be set aside in favor of scientific data. The Inupiaq language remains alive in Kaktovik, spoken particularly by elders for whom it is a first language, and efforts to maintain and transmit it to younger generations remain an active community priority. Like indigenous languages worldwide, Inupiaq carries within it an irreplaceable record of accumulated environmental knowledge, cultural values, and ways of understanding the world that simply cannot be fully translated into English without significant loss. And language revitalization efforts are understood within the community not merely as cultural sentiment, but as practical efforts to preserve genuinely useful knowledge and irreplaceable ways of knowing, encoded in linguistic forms that have no equivalent outside the language itself. The school's incorporation of Inupiaq language instruction and community programs encouraging its use by young people represent the front lines of an effort whose significance goes well beyond the language itself to the entire body of knowledge and cultural continuity it carries. Social life in Kaktovik carries the distinctive quality of all small, tight-knit communities where everyone genuinely knows everyone else, and where the web of kinship, long shared history, and mutual dependence creates a social fabric quite unlike what is found in larger, more anonymous communities elsewhere. People help each other with practical tasks as a matter of course, sharing food from successful hunts, helping with home repairs, watching children, and providing support through the inevitable difficulties of life, in a place where outside professional services are rarely available, and community mutual support is not optional but genuinely essential. The sharing networks at the heart of the subsistence economy, the formal protocols governing how whale meat and muktuk and caribou and other harvest products are distributed through the community, represent the most visible and most culturally significant expression of this ethic of mutual support, an ethic rooted in thousands of years of experience, demonstrating that in an Arctic environment, individual self-sufficiency alone is insufficient, and that community interdependence is the only reliable foundation for genuine security. Traditional Inupiat celebrations and cultural events punctuate the annual calendar, providing occasions for communal gathering, cultural expression, and the transmission of traditional knowledge and values to younger community members. Nalukatak, the traditional blanket toss celebration held following a successful whaling season, is among the most significant, a joyful community event in which participants are launched high into the air from a large blanket held by community members, a practice rooted in the traditional use of the blanket toss for spotting distant game from elevation on the flat tundra landscape, transformed into a communal celebration expressing the joy and gratitude of a successful harvest shared across the whole community. The laughter and energy of Nalukatak, the sharing of food prepared from the whale harvest, the songs and dances that accompany the celebration represent a living expression of cultural continuity, a visible demonstration that the traditions are not merely remembered, but actively practiced, felt, and transmitted through participation rather than simply studied at a respectful distance. Traditional Inupiat drumming and dance carry enormous cultural significance, with distinct songs and dance styles associated with specific families, specific events, and specific moments in community history, a living archive of cultural memory encoded in performed form and transmitted through the participation of dancers and drummers who learn from those who know the songs and must themselves teach others before the knowledge can continue. Community drum dance gatherings bring together residents of all ages, with children observing and gradually participating, learning through presence and imitation in the way that traditional knowledge has always been transmitted most effectively, through doing alongside those who already know, in a community where the doing has immediate, present significance rather than being a historical exercise. These gatherings are genuinely emotional occasions for many participants, connecting present experience directly to ancestral practice in ways that purely intellectual engagement with history simply cannot replicate. The relationship between Kaktovik and the outside world has been shaped by a history of contact that, as with most Alaska Native communities, was not always gentle or respectful of indigenous ways of life and indigenous self-determination. Missionary activity in the late 19th and early 20th centuries brought significant pressure toward the adoption of Christianity and away from traditional spiritual practices, while federal educational policies during the mid-20th century, including boarding school systems that removed Native children from their communities and prohibited the use of indigenous languages, inflicted cultural damage whose consequences continue to echo in communities across Alaska, including Kaktovik. Understanding contemporary community life in Kaktovik requires some awareness of this history, not as a reason for paralysis or guilt, but as essential context for understanding why language revitalization matters so much, why subsistence rights are so non-negotiable in community political advocacy, and why the relationship between outside institutions and this community is navigated with a kind of careful, watchful attention earned through long experience of what outside institutional engagement can mean for small indigenous communities without sufficient power to set the terms of that engagement themselves. Despite all of this history, and in some ways because of it, Kaktovik represents a community of remarkable resilience and genuine cultural vitality, one that has maintained its subsistence practices, its language, its traditional ecological knowledge, and its fundamental orientation toward the Arctic landscape, even through the most disruptive periods of outside pressure and forced change. This resilience is not simply the passive persistence of tradition against change, but the active, ongoing work of specific people within the community who have chosen to prioritize cultural continuity, who have fought through political and legal channels for subsistence rights and language programs and land protections that make that continuity possible, and who have adapted traditional practices and knowledge to contemporary conditions rather than treating tradition and modernity as necessarily incompatible. Young people in Kaktovik today grow up in a world where smartphones and satellite internet connect them instantly to global popular culture, where they watch the same streaming content as teenagers anywhere else in America, listen to the same music, engage with the same social media platforms, and navigate the same complex landscape of contemporary youth culture that young people everywhere experience. And simultaneously, they go out with their fathers and uncles and grandfathers to hunt caribou on the tundra. They stand at the edge of the water when the whale is brought in, and learn the songs and protocols that mark the harvest as something more than a simple food procurement activity. They hear the elders speak Inupiaq and understand at least something of what is said, and they understand in some fundamental bodily way that they belong to a place and a tradition that is genuinely different from anything available through a screen or accessible by traveling to Fairbanks or Anchorage or further south. Navigating these two realities, holding them simultaneously without denying the genuine value of either, is the central challenge and the central work of being a young person in Kaktovik today. The question of oil development in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge continues to cast a long shadow over daily life and community politics in Kak.